Well, welcome everybody to the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program's Winter Webinar Series, Fun with Wood Decay Fungi. I am Kate Four, and I work for the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program, a partnership between UVM Extension and Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. I will be moderating the webinar this evening. Our presenter tonight is Isabel Munck with the USDA Forest Service. Isabel is a forest pathologist with the Forest Service, state and private forestry, forest health protection. She is based out of the Durham field office. She came to Durham from California, where she completed a project investigating the effects of anti- and de-icing salt applications to road and fuel reduction treatments on tree health in the Lake Tahoe Basin. Isabel has a PhD in plant pathology from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where she helped develop management strategies for Diplodia shoot blight on pine plantations. Prior to her doctoral work, Isabel completed a study on the impacts of beech bark disease and the sustainability and health of forests in New York, as well as part of her master's program at SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. So she certainly brings a lot of experience, and we're really fortunate to have her present to us tonight. And so, Isabel, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to you for a little bit of fun with wood decay fungi.
Thank you, Kate, and welcome everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Is the volume okay?
Yep, you sound great, so I'm
okay.
Sure we'll hear.
All right. All right, great, thank you. So tonight's talk will be about wood decay fungi, and these are the objectives I like to cover today. And as Kate mentioned, we will be quizzing you, and please feel free to interrupt me or, let me know if you have any questions through the chat box. So the objectives for today's talk are, first, to put decay in the context of risk tree assessment. Kate mentioned that the reason she was interested in presenting this topic to the group is because decay can be an issue in risk tree assessments, and what is the significance of when you see a fruiting body? What does that mean to the tree and how hazardous it might be? Then I'd like to cover briefly tree resistance to decay or how trees combat decay fungi, and then follow that with an introduction to wood decay fungi and cover the 10 most common wood decayers that I see in urban trees in our area. So when we do hazard tree trainings, and we do these in the Forest Service, I think the International Society of Arborists also conducts hazard tree trainings. There's several defects that we train people to look for. Cracks, root problems, weak branch unions, poor tree architecture, dead tops, and decayed wood is one of them. So what is decayed wood? Decayed wood is wood that's been rotted or missing wood. Decay is usually caused by decay fungi. Other organisms like bacteria can also cause decay, but they're not as good at it as fungi, because fungi can produce a lot of chemicals that can break down the complex structure of wood. Decayed wood has less structural strength, so trees that are decayed can fail. Indicators of decay include cavities, so where the wood's being rotted, you can see that there's missing parts of the wood, fruiting bodies, bulges, and open cracks. And what we tell people that are being trained to assess hazard trees is that at least 40% of the circumference is to be affected by decay to remove the tree, or any large branch with decay should be removed. So this leads us to the first quiz, which is, does presence of a conk or fruiting structure of a fungus mean that a tree must be removed?
So just a reminder, folks, so in order to respond to this is a yes-no question. I see Mary's gone ahead and submitted her answer. And for the folks who are just joining us and may not have caught the introduction, you can find the icon to submit your response. It's the fourth icon in under your name on the participant panel, and you'll see yes, no underneath that. It's a checkbox. Go ahead and select your answer now.
So it sounds like most of you did not respond, or if you did, you said no, which is the correct answer. Just because there's a fruiting body on a tree doesn't mean that the tree must be removed, although sometimes it means that there's advanced stages of decay. So that covers our first objective for the discussion. The next is tree resistance to decay. Trees, when they're alive, usually you find decay wood in the heartwood of the tree. Trees are very good at defending themselves, and they try to maintain the decay organisms from attacking the living part of the tree. So the living part of the tree is just on the outer ring very close to the bark. I should mention that the bark is very good at keeping decay fungi away, but after the bark, the part of the living tree that's alive and is very good at defending the tree against decay is right underneath the bark. So in alive trees, the decay is usually in the center on the heartwood of the tree. Whereas in dead trees, once the tree is dead and cannot actively defend itself against decay, decay is usually in the sapwood, what used to be the living part of the tree, which is very susceptible to decay once the tree has died. So usually live trees decay from the inside out, and dead trees decay from the outside in. Although trees look like they're not, they're just standing there, they're actually very good at defending them. Because they cannot move, they're actually very good at defending themselves. And the way that trees defend themselves against decay is they try to compartmentalize the decay in an area. So they try to limit its spread. And here in the bottom, you can see that this tree was wounded at some point, and there's a decay organism that's decaying it. But it's being able to successfully limit the decay to the time of the wounding, and it's growing around it, putting growth rings around it. In this picture, you see a tree that all this light-colored wood in the cross-section is the sapwood, or the live part of the tree. This darker section is the heartwood. Heartwood used to be alive, but it's no longer alive. However, the tree deposits chemicals in that part of the wood, and therefore it becomes decay resistant. And when fungi decay trees, you often see discoloration as shown here, and then eventually missing parts of wood. This CODIT, or compartmentalization decay in trees model was created by Shigo to explain how trees defend themselves against decay. It's a model, so it doesn't work exactly this way, but it helps us understand. There's 4 walls of decay resistance that the tree puts out. The first wall limits decay up and down the tree, so this way, and that's the trachid cells in the tree. The second wall, these walls are both chemical and physical. The second wall limits the spread of decay inward, so in this direction, and it's partially achieved by the annual rings that the tree puts out every year, so that's a physical barrier. And then the third wall limits the spread of decay sideways like this, and that's usually created again physically by the raised cells of the tree. And then lastly, the fourth wall limits the spread of decay to the living part of the tree, and it's chemical. So different species of trees have different resistance to decay. Some are very decay resistant and some are not. And here I'd like to point out, for example, black locust, which is used frequently in urban settings, is very resistant to decay in comparison to things like aspen, which are notorious because they're very susceptible to decay, or birch is also very susceptible to decay. And then in the middle we have trees that are again used often for street trees, are oaks, which are somewhat resistant to decay. And another very common tree around here is eastern white pine. Is again moderately resistant. But most of the hardwoods that we see planted along streets in the Northeast are, the heartwood is non-resistant to decay. So here's our second quiz question. This one is multiple choice, and the question is, which of the walls is most important in compartmentalizing decay in living trees? Okay. So most of you have answered D, and that's a good answer. All of the walls are important. However, the answer I was looking for is C, and that's wall 4. And if we go back to the picture, whoops, that's the wall that limits the decay from entering the living part of the tree. The tree tries at all costs to save this part of itself because that's living and growing. And that's where the water and sugars are transported. So I don't know, does anyone have any questions? You can feel free to use the chat box to ask questions as we move along the slides. Okay, so now I like to cover, okay, so there's a question from Bonnie, why is 4 more important? Because 4 is the wall that saves it's a chemical wall, and it stops decay from affecting the living part of the tree, the xylem and the phloem. The tree, I mean, it can withstand decay if it goes up and down the hardwood, because even if the tree was hollow in the middle, it would still be very strong because it's a cylinder. However, as soon as you start killing the living part of the tree can die. That's why when you girdle a tree, it dies, because you killed the living part of the tree, even though the rest of the tree is sound. Does that make sense? Another question, is there emerald ash borer fungal interaction? No, I mean, not directly. You could assume that maybe fungi could exploit the entry holes that emerald ash borer causes, but that wouldn't kill the tree. I mean, the tree would probably already be killed by emerald ash borer. No, I mean, a tree gets killed by emerald ash borer right away, so decay fungi have no chance of contributing to the death. Another question is, what makes species more resistant to decay? That's a really good question. I would think it's the chemicals. You know, trees use the heartwood of the tree as kind of a repository for all the chemicals. So, for example, in the fall, a lot of the deciduous trees lose their leaves, and a lot of the extra chemicals that the tree doesn't need are put out in those leaves, and then that's how it disposes of bad chemicals. But in trees that are coniferous, they don't lose their leaves, and so they put all their chemicals into the hardwood. And I think hardwoods do that too. They use the heartwood to dump their chemicals. But a lot of conifers are very decay resistant. Their heartwood is very decay resistant. Does that make sense? Okay, so moving on to introduction to decay fungi. So here's a diagram of how a fungus if you were to cut a tree that's being decayed by a fungus, what you would see. You'd see that the wood is discolored as the fungus decomposes the wood. A lot of decay fungi exploit wounds to enter the tree, so branches that are broken, mowing wounds, insect wounds, and once they enter, they start growing through the cells of the tree, like here. And they grow through the cells, so they use the tree as a house and also as food. They put out chemicals that break down the cell walls of wood, and that's what they eat. And when a fruiting body of a fungus can produce millions of spores per minute. I mean, these things are just loaded with spores. So they release a lot of spores into the air, and that's how they get around. There's 2 types of decay that are described, white rot and brown rot. So usually decay fungi are either white rotters or brown rotters. There's a question of, do you need the fruiting body to identify the species? The answer is no, you don't need the fruiting body. You can sometimes tell by the kind of rot that's being caused what the fruiting body is, and also the tree. The tree species is important. And now if you can do DNA analysis, you can determine what the species is. Or also you can try to culture the fungus out of the wood and see what it looks like in artificial medium. But it's very hard. I mean, these things are more complicated. It's much easier if you can see a fruiting body. So decay fungi can usually cause either white rot or brown rot, and the color of the wood that's left behind is what determines whether the decay organism is a brown rot or a white rot. White rot fungi decompose. Wood is made out of cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. And lignin is brown and cellulose is white. Cellulose is very structurally stable. It's long chains of sugars, and lignin is a more complicated structure. But anyhow, white rot fungi decompose both lignin and cellulose. So what they have left behind is mostly cellulose, as seen here. And white rot is usually stringy and spongy, whereas brown rot fungi or decay fungi do not decompose cellulose. They only decompose, they eat the cellulose but leave the lignin behind. So all this brown rot, decayed wood, is the lignin that's left behind. Brown rot is usually called dry rot, but this is not accurate because it needs moisture. The fungi, all fungi need moisture and oxygen to decay wood. So often, once you cut a tree that has that's been decayed by a decay fungus, it can no longer decay it because the tree dries out, the wood dries out, and it cannot live there anymore. So when you see a tree that's decayed, you can tell what kind of fungi are decaying it by whether it's caused by brown rot. If you see white rot or brown rot, that tells you something about the organism that's decaying it. Brown rots are usually more common in conifers. White rots affect conifers and hardwood species. The position of the decay is also important. Some fungi only decay the main stem, and others decay the top of the trees, and whereas others decay the butt rot or the root rot. So if you see a fruiting structure at the roots or at the main stem or the top of the tree, that tells you something about the decay organism and the biology of the decay organism. So Kate has added a link here. That's where I got this picture from, and this link is really this webpage was developed by a forest pathologist, and it's very good. It has a lot of good lessons. Another way that you can tell decay fungi apart is whether they produce an annual fruiting body or perennial fruiting body. Annual fruiting bodies, like the name says, are produced every year, or they're not persistent, whereas perennial fruiting bodies are there once they get established, or they produce a new spore layer every year. So annual fruiting bodies tend to be fleshy and fall apart more easily, whereas perennial fruiting bodies are woody and hard. And then another thing that you can use to try to tell these fungi apart is their spore surface, or where they produce spores. As I mentioned earlier, they produce a lot of spores, and the spore-bearing layer is modified in different ways, and the point of all these different structures is to increase the surface area where the fungus can produce spores. So for something like an oyster mushroom here, you can see it has gills, and another fungus here has pores. Other fungi have teeth, and yet others have kind of like modified gills that look like a mace. So we've covered some things like white rot versus brown rot, and where in the tree the fungus can occur. and also the different spore-producing surfaces. So now I'm going to show you a picture of a decayed tree with a fungus right here. And using your chat box, I want you to maybe tell me some things that you're seeing. Do you think it's a white rotter or a brown rotter, or is it a perennial fruiting body or an annual fruiting body? Do you think it has pores versus gills? Yep, those observations are correct. It is a perennial fruiting body with pores, and it's kind of hard to tell if it's whether it's a brown or a white rotter because the tree kind of looks brown inside, but usually when you see these long splinters, that means it's a white rotter. Brown rotters break up the wood bricks like cubes. It doesn't break in long splinters. And yes, it is a perennial fruiting body. It's woody. So those are very good observations. Okay. So now that we've covered the basics, I'm going to go over the 10 most common wood decayers of urban trees. And these are the ones that I see most commonly in this area. And the list that was compiled based on a book that's the reference is provided at the end, but it's a book written by Christopher Lully. So I'm listing, in the first few slides, I'll show you the 3 most important ones. And then after that, I'll show you a total of 10 fungi. But the first 3 are the most important. After that, the order is not there's no reason to be ordered. They're not ordered by significance except for the first 3. But the first one is Armillaria root rot. This is a very important fungus. It was called a fungus humongous a few years, or maybe 10 years ago. There was a paper published where they found this. They named this as the largest organism in a forest in Oregon. It fruits in the fall, and you see these honey-colored mushrooms, which are edible. But most of the fungus lives underneath the soil, and it spreads to the soil through these black things called rhizomorphs, which I'll show you here. These are rhizomorphs, and when you see these on a tree, that means that the tree is dead. It's dead or it's dying. But that's what the fungus uses to get around. Another sign of the fungus is these white mycelial fans you can find them underneath the bark of declining trees. Armillaria is very common. Not only there's a question of whether the rhizomorphs shown are only for Armillaria. I believe so. I think Armillaria is the only thing that creates black rhizomorphs. However, there's at least 9 Armillaria species, and it's very hard to tell them apart unless you do DNA analysis. Some occur more frequently on hardwoods, and some occur more frequently on conifers. And yes, they are edible. But I would caution you because there's other things that look like Armillaria. So if you're not sure, just be careful. Some of them can be poisonous. Armillaria spores are white, so one way to tell if it's Armillaria is you can take the cap off the day that you find it and put it on a black piece of paper overnight, and then in the morning the spores will have come out, and if they're white, that's one of the indicators that it's Armillaria. So Armillaria causes root and bud rot, and that greatly increases the risk of tree failures. The tree can look totally okay, and then there's a windstorm, and if it has Armillaria root rot, it can be pushed over. Armillaria is common where trees are planted near forests, or where, like a lot of times in Christmas tree nurseries, trees are planted in what used to be forest land, and there's still Armillaria on the soil, so then the trees become infected. In urban settings, Armillaria is very common in forest settings. It usually only kills trees that are being defoliated. So, for example, oaks that are being defoliated by gypsy moth are then susceptible to Armillaria. And the way that Armillaria knows that the tree is, the tree has compromised immune system is because Armillaria is living close to the roots, and when a tree is healthy, it stores carbohydrates as starch. But let's say that a tree gets defoliated, then all that starch gets converted to sugar so that the tree can make leaves. And so the Armillaria can sense that and and then attack the tree, which is compromised already. Once you see mycelial fans or mushrooms, those are indicators of advanced stages of decline, and that tree should definitely be inspected and probably removed. Different species of Armillaria affect conifers and hardwoods. Virtually all trees are affected. It causes white rot, and the mushrooms have gills. They have a white spore. They usually have a ring, and they fruit in clumps. So here's a picture of the mushrooms again. You can see that there's a ring, and they're fruiting in clumps. They fruit usually in the fall or late summer. Yes, infected trees are more likely to fail at ground level or at the butt. Okay. Moving on to the second most important fungus, it's Ganoderma lucidum. There's no common name for this in English, but there's common names in this in Asia, and I can't remember them because this is a medicinal mushroom for Asian cultures. It has anti-cancer properties and thank you, it's reishi. That's in Japanese. I can't remember the name in Chinese. And it also has antimicrobial and antiviral properties. Here you can see that there's a fruiting body at the bottom of the tree. It usually fruits in the base of the tree, and it has this very rich varnished mahogany color on the top. It's shiny. And then in the bottom, it has a white spore layer. So do you think that this is annual or perennial? It looks perennial, but it's actually annual. If you were to touch this, it breaks apart and it's fleshy, so it's perennial. But sometimes the fruiting body, it means perennial, it produces spores only 1 year, but it can remain on the tree. And the way that this is used medicinally is it's dried up and ground into powder, and people drink it as tea. So this is a very common cause of root and butt rot in urban trees. I don't see this in the forest very often. Presence of fruiting bodies is not a reason alone for removal, but infected trees do fail. So if you see this in an urban tree, this should probably check to make sure that the decay isn't more than 40% of the circumference. It has a lot of hosts, most hardwoods. It causes white rot, and it decays mostly the butt rot. It says here roots, but it's mostly at the butt rot level. And it's an annual fruiting body. Again, it has a varnished mahogany top, so this is important to remember because the next fungus I'm going to talk about is also Ganoderma. And it has that white pore layer. And the fruiting occurs in summer or fall. So fruiting occurs in summer or fall. That means I'm only going to provide that information for annual fruiting bodies because perennial ones are always there. So the third fungus is Ganoderma applanatum. And do you think this is woody or perennial? The answer is yes, it's perennial. It's woody. It's very tough. I mean, you can see that there's someone standing on it. This is Joseph O'Brien. If you look at the photo credits, he has taken most of the pictures that I'll have used for this presentation. He's a pathologist with the Forest Service. Anyhow, this Ganoderma applanatum is also called artist conch. You can draw on the bottom side of the surface. It's the same genus as the previous Ganoderma lucidum, but the way you can tell them apart is that the top of Ganoderma applanatum is woody and brown, whereas the other one was varnished. And this picture shows why this is a perennial fungus. Every year it puts a spore layer. So it kind of looks like the rings of the trees, except they're facing down because that's where the spores are released. So when you see this fungus, it usually indicates that the tree is very, very decayed and You know, it definitely should be tested not only once, but if the tree is not removed periodically. There's a lot of species that are susceptible to this fungus. Most are hardwoods. It causes white root and butt rot, and also extends to the stem. It's perennial, and it's got a woody conk with a brown top and a white spore layer. And the spores are brown. Okay, so from now on I'm going to be talking about different fungi, and the order of them doesn't matter. They're not ordered by importance. So I kind of cheated here and gave you two for the price of one. These are hen of the woods on the left and chicken of the woods on the right. Both of these fungi produce several layers of caps at the bases of trees, and they usually affect oaks. You can see here that hen of the woods is brown on the top, and chicken of the woods is bright yellow or bright orange. So do you think these are annual or perennial fruiting bodies? Yes, they're definitely annual. And these are both edible. They're choice edible. I mean, that's why they have these names, hen of the woods or chicken of the woods. But I have to warn you that some people have reactions to chicken of the woods when they eat it in conjunction with alcohol. Also, sometimes you can find chicken of the woods on conifer species, and that's probably a different type of fungus. So if you find it on a pine tree or in a conifer, don't eat it. Hen of the woods is not an indicator of enhanced decay, whereas chicken of the woods is. Chicken of the woods causes brown rot, and usually when you see chicken of the woods, the trees are highly decayed. Both of these species are common on oak trees. Chicken of the woods is also common on black cherry. Again, hen of the woods causes white rot, whereas chicken of the woods causes brown rot. Hen of the woods has a brown top and a white spore layer, whereas chicken of the woods is all yellow and orange, and both have pores. Okay. So moving on to Phellinus robineae. Phellinus is a genus of heart rot decay fungi. Here I'm talking about Phellinus robineae, which is the only decay fungus that can decay black locust. But there's other species of Phellinus that affect other hardwood species, and they're all very good decayers of heart rot. Because black locust is so decay resistant, this fungus decays black locust very slowly, but it does cause stem failure, so if you see it, you should probably check the tree to make sure that it's okay. It is a white heart rot, and it decays the stem. It's a woody perennial conk, and the top of it is cracked, shown here, and then it has a cinnamon-colored spore layer. And most of the fungi I've been talking about so far have porous spore layers. Here it's CODIT, or brown rots in general more serious, more likely to need removal. Not necessarily. It's just that in the case of chicken of the woods, it's just a more aggressive decay organism than hen of the woods. So Phellinus causes white heart rot, and Phellinus fungi are very good decayers. So if you see a woody conk that looks like Phellinus, it's usually something serious. Okay. So this is kind of a fun one. Northern tooth, I see this a lot on maples. This is an annual fruiting body. It appears usually in the late summer, fall. As I mentioned earlier, most of the fungi we covered so far have porous fruiting layers, whereas this one has teeth. And it usually forms all these caps, so many caps on a tree. Although it's very flashy fruiting body, it doesn't usually indicate that the tree is seriously decayed, and it does not mean that the tree should be removed. The most common hosts are maples, especially sugar maple. It's a white heart rot, and it causes stem decay, so it's not usually found in the bottom of the tree. It's only found on the upper stem. It's It's cream colored and it has those overlapping caps with teeth. Similar in its host selection is Dryad saddle, which is Polyporus squamosus. Polyporus is an annual fruiting body, and you can see the top has these scale look-like things. That's why it's called squamosus, because squamosus means scale. The bottom of it is usually cream colored, and when the fungus is young, as shown here, it has this really cool like beehive pattern in the bottom. You can see it has a stem. Dryad saddle is very common in old wounds, but it's not often a indicator of, a high hazard tree. I see it mostly on maples, but elms and horse chestnuts and other hardwoods are also susceptible. It causes white stem rot, and when it's fresh, it smells like watermelon. So that's something to look for. It's supposed to be not edible, although I've heard conflicting reports about that. Okay. So this is a mistake over here. I don't know what happened to this slide, but this is a photo credit. It's the name of this fungus is Daedalea. Over here, Daedalea quercina. It affects oaks, and the way I remember this, because this fungus has no common name, is by the genus name Daedalea. I don't know if you know the story of the Greek mythology of the Minotaur, but he was an evil monster, and he was kept in a maze to stop it from hurting people. So the person that created the maze was called Daedalus. And here's a picture. The porous layer of this fungus looks like a maze, so that's how I remember the name. It's commonly found on oaks, and it's a perennial fruiting body. It doesn't usually mean that the tree has to be removed. I see it often in parts that are dead parts of the tree, and it causes brown stem heart rot. Okay, so we're getting towards the end. Number 9 is the oyster mushroom. This is, along with Armillaria, the only other fungus I've shown you with gills. Oyster mushrooms don't necessarily cause decay, but they are an indicator the tree is declining. I mean, oyster mushrooms fruit on dead wood, so a tree has to have a lot of dead wood for you to see oyster mushrooms. They affect a variety of hosts: maple, elm, cottonwood, willow, poplar, and so on. It causes sap rot, and as I mentioned, fruits on the dead parts of the stem. The mushrooms are white, and they have gills, and this is definitely edible and very good to eat. Fruiting occurs in summer and fall. And this is the last one, the split gill fungus. I see this a lot in young urban trees that have thin bark, like ironwoods or maples, that are planted in streets, and then the trees get sun-scald in the winter or winter injury, and then you see this fruiting bodies. So it's an indicator of recently killed parts of the bark or cambium. The texture of it is like cardboard paper. It has a lot of hosts, all hardwoods. And then I'll go back. It doesn't have true gills. It's called a split gill fungus because you see the gills aren't going all the way through. They kind of fork. So the top of the fungus is kind of fuzzy, and the bottom has these split gills, and it has a cardboard texture. It causes white sap rot, and it's grayish or whitish. It's usually the first fungus that appears in recently killed trees with thin bark. So now, this is the last question, and this is in a multiple choice or yes or no, so you're going to have to use the chat box. But the question is, what are the top 3 most important wood decay fungi of urban trees? That's right, Armillaria is one of them. It's number 1. Yep, that's right. Good memory, Ganoderma, applanatum. Yep, you got all of them. Ganoderma, lucidum. So I'll go back. So these are the top 3. Number 1 is Armillaria. It causes butt rot and lots of tree failures in urban trees. And then the number 2 is Ganoderma lucidum. It has the varnished top and the white spore layer. And number 3 is a lot like Ganoderma lucidum, but it's Ganoderma applanatum or artist conk. It has the woody top, brown top, and the white spore layer. So the last thing I wanted to provide you is with the references that I used. The first reference is the Urban Tree Risk Management Manual by the Forest Service. You can get this online, and it talks about decay and other defects of urban trees. Then Jim Worrell's webpage is a very good resource for anything. It has a lesson on decay, but he also has lessons of other forest pathogens. And then there's this manual of biodeterioration of wood, which has cool information about decay fungi and how trees are decayed. And then the last reference is Christopher Louis with decay fungi, which is available on his webpage, and I think it costs $24. So with that, I guess, and that's my contact information. That concludes my lesson. So
great, thank you so much, Isabel. Are there any questions from folks? Maybe we'll give a minute for we have a little bit of time left, so let's go ahead and see if there are any questions out there.
Oh, thank you for your attention. I forgot to thank you.
It looks like we have at least one question coming in, so while she's working on that, I was going to try to go ahead and link to Chris Louis' book. While the questions are coming in, I just wanted to put an extra plug in for Chris Louis' book. You'll find the link there. Lucy provided it in the chat box, and it's a great resource. It's very user-friendly. It's full of pictures, and so if you're interested at all in this and want to learn more about tree decay fungi, it's certainly a great resource. So looks like we have a couple of questions, Isabel, so I'll go ahead and let you answer them.
So one of the questions is, how many wood decay fungi? There's hundreds of wood decay fungi, but not that many that I've seen on urban trees. So I'm not sure. I covered 10 in Chris Louis' book, which I think is great. I think maybe there's not more than 20. So what's the difference between leaf fungi and bark fungi? So actually decay fungi are not really bark fungi. They're heartwood or saprot fungi. But leaf fungi are ascomycetes. Decay fungi are basidiomycetes, so how they form spores is different. And where they live is different. Leaf fungi are more ephemeral. They're not as, decay fungi are here to stay. So they produce a lot more chemicals, and they just have different ways of affecting the tree.
Isabel, looks like we have one or two more questions. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, the chestnut blight was a fungus, and that was a canker fungus. So it can. What it did is it kills the living parts of the tree. That's why the tree died so quickly. Like decay fungi decay the heartwood of the tree. They usually cannot decay the sap wood unless the tree is dead. But chestnut blight can kill the living part of the tree.
And it looks like we have another question about the difference between leaf fungi and back fungi.
I think that was meant to be bark fungi.
Oh,
but
bark.
I don't know. Yeah, leaf fungi enter the leaves through the holes, the stomata, and they usually feed on on the sugars that the leaves are producing. Whereas bark fungi or decay fungi, maybe that's what the question is, they feed on the wood of the tree, so they produce a lot more chemicals to decay that wood. And they are usually, leaf fungi are more ephemeral, they get around, they try to move around a lot so that they can match, they can follow the leaves. Whereas decay fungi usually stay in the stem of the tree.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Isabel. I really appreciate all your time and you sharing your expertise with us. It's a lot of information you shared, so thank you so much. I just wanted to, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump on you.
No, thank you. It was fun.
Thank you again. And so, folks, just a couple of quick reminders. As I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, we are looking for your feedback on these webinar series, so please do take a minute and complete our online evaluation. We'll pop that link up in the chat box in a second here. But please go ahead and after the webinar this evening, complete that evaluation and let us know not only how we did, but what other topics you want to see in the future. Just wanted to give you a quick reminder and a plug for our next webinar. As you know, this is part of a series, and so our February webinar will be focused on planning for EAB. We'll be hearing stories from around the state. So please join us on February 19th from 7 to 8 p.m. To learn more about what's going on around the state to prepare for EAB. So that's it for the webinar this evening, and thank you again for your presentation, Isabel, and thank you for your participation, folks, and have a good evening.